All right. Welcome everyone to the Heaven and Earth podcast. I'm Crystal,
And I'm Matthew Merlin.
and we're here today with the epic and beautiful and wise Julie McIntyre. And we're sitting here with Rose as requested and being brought in by Julie. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we chose Rose and the kind of conversation that Rose is going to be holding space for with us today after Matthew tells us a little bit about the very interesting astrological weather.
Yeah, so today the moon is in Virgo in the same sign as Venus and Mercury, which on its own is great for communication and harmony. However, currently Mercury is just finished stationing retrograde, and the planet Saturn, who is the lord of death and loss, is currently forming an opposition to all of these planets in Virgo, as well as a square to the Mars-Jupiter conjunction that is happening in Gemini. So there's a lot of there's a lot of heaviness going on today. And so in keeping with that, we wanted to discuss some things that aren't often talked about, but should be more frequently in grief and processing letting go.
Yeah, and Julie, with her, has immense wisdom about working with the intelligence of the heart that has, radically changed my life and the life of everybody who's received these teachings from her. And she's passed through I'm actually just gonna just gonna pass it off to Julie now. And yeah, so what would you, if whatever you would like to share, if you want about Rose or about grief now in this opening window, you're most welcome.
Well, thank you, Crystal and Matthew, for this generous invitation and introduction. Thank you very, very much. I'm deeply appreciative. So, rose was never really my herb. It was never, I had a sort of distant relationship with it. It's a lot of respect and beauty and appreciated its beauty and its thorns, but I was never really attracted to it until grief. And sorry.
No.
Um, in the midst of the death of my love, people I had never met were sending me rose elixirs, rose tinctures, rose attar, which is the most amazing ancient alchemical powerful aroma of rose. Is said to be the scent that was Rumi's scent that was used during his death process, and for the mourners. And so it was during that where I really got to know the power of rose and its effect on healing the heart and opening the heart and moving and opening up and making sure that nothing gets stuck. It just keeps moving, and it's cools. I found it to be cooling some of the grief rage that comes along with grief and great loss, and cooling that and opening it and smoothing out a lot of the sharp edges and a lot of the pain. And I made a big spray bottle of rose with rose essential oil, and I walk around my land. I spray the trees with rose, and the most extraordinary things happen. A lot of us have a relationship with plants, with our land, with trees, and we'll take things and offerings to them, and sometimes a little wine or a little whiskey, and share that with them. But during that process for the whole year, I was walking around my land and spraying rose, and it was extraordinary. Some days I would go, before I'd even squeeze down the pump, the spirits would rise up and meet and just embrace and have just changed the entire energy, welcoming this and wanting it and being thankful for it. And so it really deepened my relationship with my land through Rose as sort of a channel. I don't know if deepen's right, because we were going really, really deep. Anyway, they helped so much with grief and held that and taught me about grieving in the wild and with the wild, and
Grieving with the wild.
grieving with the wild, right? Because they know grief. Earth knows grief and knows how to hold it without changing anything, without saying it'll be okay, without without a lot of the human tendencies to say too much or say too little. It just holding everything without judgment, without shifting, and just letting everything flow that way. So Rose then became, it's only been a year and a half, but we're becoming really good friends. It's been a very, very good ally for me and my land, and the trees just opened up a whole nother piece for me.
Wow. And so with this, so before we started recording, you had mentioned that grief is a topic that doesn't get addressed in kind of, what we call the overculture, or the how do we want to refer to this? The mainstream culture. And that's something that, in your work as well as in Stephen's work, and for those of you who aren't familiar, I don't know if you want to say some words about Stephen's work, but his book, Earth Grief, I feel like is really rattled a lot of cages for people who were wise enough or fortunate enough to come into contact with that vein of wisdom. Is there anything that you'd like to say here early on, or I guess what you'd really like people to know the most about the grief portal, and the gifts that come with it, the difficulties that you have to sit with? Just sorry.
Sure. There are some tentative movements culture-wide and society-wide to attempt to broach the topic of grief. And I've looked at some of them. It's not, and I'm glad there's some movements toward it. I have never wanted to linger long on the surface of things. So I'm a deep diver by nature, and which is a good thing, because with grief, I was willing to go and sit on the bottom of the Mariana Trench for as long as it took. And while Stephen was dying, we went through the grieving process together, exactly the way we lived our life, with no secrets, no holding back, talking about everything. Nothing was taboo. So we got to grieve together because of that. And we just threw ourselves into it and deepened our relationship, deepened the intimacy, deepened everything that we were already doing, became more honest, deeper, more intimate, tighter bond. Yeah, so I think, I believe, I know it's very, very important to be talking about everything out loud, without censoring, without, these things are acceptable to talk about in a relationship, and these things are not. And I see relationships like that, and they're not the kind of relationship I've ever wanted, that throw myself into it. We just, threw ourselves into, as students of the School Without Walls or Without Borders, we kind of throw ourselves into things and go along, and then we figure out the pieces we missed retrograde, but just throwing ourselves into it wholeheartedly, no holds barred. I mean, that's life. That's vitality. That's
right.
we're born to do this, and we're not as fragile as we think we are. There were times where I was so broken afterwards, and I would step back and be in absolute amazement, knowing that other people are doing this and going through this, and we have the capacity to do it. We can do it, and we don't know we can do it until we're called and we're demanded, and we're thrust into it. And we have choices, but mine was always to go deeper and deeper. And I knew before Stephen died that grief was already in our house. It had been here for several years. And being a farmer and growing up in my childhood, grief was always, the death was always there, loss was there. So I knew I had a sense of the power of grief as a teacher, as a profound teacher that I had tremendous respect for. And when a god like that, when the god grief, some people use the term archetype. But my experience with grief was it was a god, and it came in and it started building rooms, and then it built a cathedral, and has a permanent cathedral in my inner house, and it will be a lifelong teacher. I don't know if it's that way for everyone, but it is that way. It's that way for me. And it's a profound teacher. It's taught a lot of things. Like, for example, people say, grief cracks you open. And then it doesn't go anywhere. The comment just sort of lays there, right? Grief cracks you open, and what do we do with that? So what happens is grief does crack you open. It cracks open all of the barriers, all the filters, everything crumble to the ground, and you have absolute direct contact with the livingness of the world. There's no membrane that we create to make it through our daily life. There's no films, there's no barrier. You're absolutely raw in the experience of life. And it's an important thing to talk about, because in that complete rawness, there's synchronicities. Jung talks about synchronicities, but the synchronicities happen really fast. They're right there. There's no barrier. There's no slow motion. There's no delay. So being aware, I had to become really aware of what I was thinking, what I was wishing for. And because then there was no time lag.
Wow.
There is normally in daily life. Those synchronicities have a time delay on them, but in the middle of grief, there is no delay.
If you accept your grief, right? Is there a caveat there that you have to go into it and do this, like really face it?
The cracking open happens whether you accept it or not. It's the accepting part is, the choosing part is choosing not to shut it down, not to turn away from grief, not to move through it at an artificial speed, to let it have you, rather than. I've started playing with language a lot during this process, and while writing, and flipping the human-centered, the human orientation to I have grief to grief has me.
Mm.
It changes the dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I started working with, and because I became a student of grief, I let it teach me. I wanted to be taught. Here I am. This is a mess. It hurts like hell. I'm a mess. But I know a great teacher when it enters my life, and that's how I let it work with me, and I watched everything. I watched my entire inner world was on the screen of my inner vision all the time.
Wow. And so that would take some real, you've spent decades, a lifetime, developing the capacity to hold that, right? And the inner strength. You spoke a lot at the retreat I attended with you in Mexico about, you know, having the strength to, you know, stay present, right? To stay in your heart and keep feeling. What would you recommend to people who are maybe new to that idea, or what would you know, what does it take? What does it take to both humble yourself and really allow yourself to feel and be present with the great teacher, with the great God that is grief?
A willingness to live an inhabited life, a willingness to be a participant, to be a student, to be humbled, a desire, hunger helps. Desire. Sometimes the hunger comes as you begin to open up all these faculties. Trust is really important. Trust. A lot of us start out without a lot of trust in family, community, ourselves.
Yeah.
And for me, I had to take baby steps in trusting myself over and over and over again and building that trust. And it happened again with grief, because when I was shattered by initially in the first many, many months, you know, a number of things happened. The ability to think linearly is shattered. It's impossible to think linearly. People call it grief brain, but that's really, it feels like a discount to what's really happening. You're not supposed to think linearly. Everything has been cracked open. Everything has been shifted. Your entire world has shifted and crumbled, and you have to start over. And I've talked to friends who have gone through similar great losses, and it's like that for them too. Their entire inner world shattered, and we have to start over and rebuild it. And in that rebuilding, it becomes stronger. And I lost my navigation skills. I lost my ability to trust myself. I lost my ability to feel. I couldn't do readings. I was in this literally on the bottom of the Mariana Trench of grief, sitting in the bottom of the ocean. And it was very yin to all this feeling, all these emotions, strong, powerful, rage, anger, terror, grief, all culminated for months, and I had to slowly, bit by bit, put it back together. And when I started walking, I understood then the power of bringing the, well, in Jung's terms, it would be anima and animus, as grieving and feeling is very anima, very feminine, very yin, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started to walk, I brought in these other elements of form, of action, that started to balance me out. And I could start to slowly put myself back together. And then I was able to do physical things. I could go into the garden, I could dig. And that was really crucial. The more I could walk, the more I could put things together physically, then I could start to bring all of these elements back together and slowly, incrementally, baby steps, testing out my navigation skills until I could build on them and build a new map and skills for going into this territory. Okay, is that making sense?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And, you know, I know there's many people who, especially in our culture, and especially since grief is so nonlinear and we live in such a linear society, who they don't have in many cases, the resources to be able, or the feeling of safety to start to lean into that. For people who are, you know, have absolutely no baseline, but want to start, they know that they're holding on to something. What kinds of practices might you recommend for them to start, you know, teasing that open?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to comment on is that it's important for us to know there is no safety. Eric Berne talks about this in James Field Play. There is no safety. And that's what, you know, our culture wants. You know, is it safe? We want safety. So understanding that there isn't any, and that you can create environments that are comfortable enough, safe enough, and being willing to take risk for your life. Fight for your life by taking risk, by extending yourself, by being vulnerable.
Fight for your life by taking risk. I just want to make sure everybody hears that, because that's a really good one. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, yes. So taking risk. And so one of the practices is awareness, is consciousness, being aware of the voices in our heads. What are they saying? Being aware of images in your dreams. What is the image telling me? What is it saying? And working with images, which we all have access to. So slowing it down enough to really start to notice. And the more you notice, the more you see, the more capable you feel, the more trust you have in yourself in navigating. We have so much. We have so much help, and we are built for these times. We are built. Well, I don't know if we were built these times, but we definitely have the skill base to develop. We have inner resources that have been in large part untapped and unused. You know, putting your phone down for a day, leaving technology for a while, because that does a whole different thing. You know, it reinforces old thinking. It reinforces a bubble, our personal bubbles. So putting those down for a while, noticing how everything feels, and it sounds big and overwhelming, but just bring it down. Like, how does this mug feel? How does this taste? And noticing, bringing our perceptions and our sensing qualities up to more and more and greater sophisticated levels. You know, for the most part, our senses are incredibly dulled. And that's really sad, because the world is full of amazing things, even in the middle of the tragedies and the horrors that are going on, and the uncertainties and the fears that we have. Is saying, I'm scared right now, and will you hold me? But that happens only if you can be present with what you're feeling, what you're noticing, and give up ideas that you have to say things perfectly. And I mean, in the beginning, I was terrified to say anything because it would be wrong. So I learned how to say, I don't know how to say this, but I'm terrified. But over practice and paying attention and noticing how things feel, how it lands, how it feels here, because our feeling is our navigation system. So I'm going to pause, because I just said a whole lot of things.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack for sure. I don't even know where to begin. Go ahead.
well, I don't want to stop you if you.
Well, I'm just thinking so much about how it seems like, in order to really give grief the respect that it deserves, you can't have in mind that you need to go anywhere or arrive somewhere. You just need to be totally surrendered into the feeling and the here and now. And that's hard for people.
It's very hard for people. Yeah. We want instant gratification. We want to feel better now. And that hasn't served us very well.
Do you think that that's part of this dimming of the senses that you're talking about? Because that feels really connected, that dimming of the senses, the everybody in their bubble, the needing safety. It's like that shrinking of, what you call, like humanity, right? Or the vital life force of humanity. It's like that feels like it's keeping our society or keeping people from being able to sit with grief, right? So it becomes this kind of like shrinking downward spiral, right? Like grief is this teacher that can crack you open, right, and take you into the immediate. But people can't even look at it, right? Because they've lost capacity. Does that make sense?
It does. But I'm going to address some of the language. People, it's not that they can't, that they're just unwilling, or they haven't been given permission. They haven't given themselves permission. They haven't wanted to discomfort themselves, because it's discomforting. It's frightening because there's so many unknowns. You go into an absolutely unknown territory, and that happens because we're not taught as children that grief is part of life, that we are going to die. So we come out into the human world being lied to pretty much right away by omission. I go for a walk every day, about every day. And there's a certain neighborhood that I walk through, and sometimes I go there specifically because there's this kind of funky metal cage arch that they've cobbled together. It looks nice, but they've taken scraps of metal, and it's this arch that goes over their driveway. And it's a metal sign on it that they've hand painted. And the sign says, Memento Mori.
Mhm.
Memento Mori. Remember you are going to die. Remember your agreement to die.
Wow.
And I walked by there, and I've stopped there so many times looking at this. And one day I went there late enough in the evening that the young men who lived there were getting home from work, and they were unpacking their trucks. And I stood there for a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there. And finally one of them looked up, and I pointed up to the sign. I said, "Thank you for this." And he got a look across his face, like trying to, he was in a different place. He was unloading his truck. And then here's a strange person saying, "Thank you for this."
Mhm.
So then it all clicked in, and he realized what I was communicating to him. He goes, "Oh, yeah, sure. But I want to know more of the story." And I don't want to know more of the story. I like the mystery of it, but there's tough construction, burly guys having this sign over their driveway. And it's a great story, but we need to remember that. Being born means we are going to die. It's not the opposite of life. It's the goal of life is to die. It's our responsibility. It's the agreement we made. Nobody gets out of this alive.
Mhm.
So we need to start being honest about it. And that changes things, absolutely changes things. I'm hypersensitive to it. I'm very sensitive to billboards that say, early cancer screening saves lives. And I want to write up there, it's like, no, it doesn't. Stop lying to people.
Mhm.
Basic things like critical thinking and catching those things so you can be honest. So we have an honest conversation about what's true. Like, what's the one true thing right now? We're in uncertain, scary times, and there's a lot of death.
Mhm.
I think it was Robert Bly, as William Stafford I read, made a comment that there's more death in earth than there are the living right now.
Mhm.
And they're beside us. We have an obligation to the dead to own our own death, our own dying, our own place that we will one day join the ancestors and stand beside them, and to honor the dead, and to say their name, and to have altars for them. They are our great teachers. They live inside of us. They live beside us, and we will join them one day. So there's a lot of places around the topic of grief. There's a lot of nodes that are connected to it that as a culture and as individuals, what's our responsibility to add to that? And not just the human memories that the ancestors carry and hold, but Earth's memories. With the climate crisis and the crumbling and the melting of shorelines and glaciers, they're holding Earth's memories as well. And we need to kind of start thinking about what are we losing during these times.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so with that, it's like with that great responsibility, which so many people aren't even aware of, right? As you're saying, because they're not taught, like with that responsibility to own our death and to honor the dying, right? Or to honor those who have passed. It's like with that responsibility, that's also our power, right? It's like so many spiritual practices that you follow and have, cultivated and held. It's like so much of spiritual practices all over are about dying well, right? And being able to communicate with and work with those who have passed on. Could you speak a little bit to that power that you get as you take up these responsibilities, or if you agree with that statement, which I don't want to assume.
Well, power is an interesting word. It's actually a fairly loaded word.
Okay. Yeah.
With a lot of different meanings. So, I mean, there's an assumption when I hear it in that context, there's an assumption about it, but we can't afford to be making assumptions right now, if ever. But so, I mean, that's a whole conversation about the concept of power. I was writing about it. There's a thing that happened when I put myself on a vision quest early on. And I also did community vision quest and was trained as a vision quest guide. But this particular one, I was still in the Midwest, along the Mississippi River in the upper Midwest, in the corner of Northeast Iowa, West Central Wisconsin on the Mississippi River. So I found a place, and I'd spent a couple of weeks walking around the forest, and I found this place to sit about 300 feet above the river. So I had access to the river, and the tree I sat under, and I was in the forest, on the edge of the forest on this limestone bluff. And the tree I sat under was this ancient, old, gnarly oak that the girth was 3 feet. It had lost a lot of limbs. It had obviously been wind swept, lightning struck.
Wow.
It still had some leaves, but to most people would say it was dead or it was dying. And it was on its way out. It was an ancient, ancient tree. But the power coming off of that tree was extraordinary. It's spiritual power coming off of this. So I set up my altar under that tree, and every day I would smoke my pipe in ceremony under this tree. All the beings, sitting in community with all the beings there. And one day in the middle of this pipe ceremony, suddenly I felt this energy come from the tree, come inside of me and remove something that I wasn't even aware of at the moment was there. It was a physical, palpable, I felt something being removed. So I was in the middle of my pipe ceremony, finish that because there's an obligation to do that. And then I started having a conversation about power with this ancient tree that had just taken it away. And I immediately understood that power that I hadn't been paying attention to, didn't even know was there. Suddenly, all the plans I was making for my life started to shift. I had to do something different. With this missing, I had to do something different.
Wow.
The shape of my life was going to be different. And I was in seconds coming to terms with this. And then I started having a conversation, being taught about spiritual power and what it means to be in service and where it comes from. So there was a whole teaching about power that it's been 25 years since that. And I'm still working with those teachings and what it means. And it came with tremendous responsibility that I considered seriously. Do I want this? Am I going to say yes to this? It has since taught me a lot about the meaning of service and devotion and being in service to something outside the self. So I just went off on a tangent. I don't know if that answered your question.
It was excellent. We have a lot of glare, so I'm just gonna try to there. I think that'll be, yeah. Is that better?
That's not better. I'm not worried about it too much.
Well, here, yeah. I just a little glare.
Mhm.
Did you have any? So that didn't feel like a tangent to me. Well, maybe it is, but it's a fascinating one. Did you have anything that you wanted to ask or a line you wanted to follow?
I mean, it seems like a lot of experiences that people have of grief do open them up to more power in some way. And by power, I don't, as it is a loaded word, I don't mean like, control, but more just being connected to the juice, lack of a better, being connected to the energy. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think that arises because of the non-linearity of grief and the fact that you can't be in your mind, in your head, figuring things out, planning, directing, having a particular agenda for how your life wants to look. You just have to surrender and let go. And I think it's in that kind of coming back to yourself that it does help people to get plugged in more.
It does. Yes, that's absolutely. Yes, that kind of power. The power of trust in yourself, trust in invisibles, trust in your relationship with the non-human world. That's powerful. There's a power when I walk my land and have conversations, or I sit with the oak on my land and have a conversation. That's a spiritual power. But there is a power that comes from being broken down and torn apart and putting yourself back together. There's a new strength. And that's power and powerful to have the agency to move through the world again. And I'm doing it tentatively because it's still these changes are still happening. It's still fairly new. So tentative.
Right. And I want to say it's an honor to talk with you in the midst of that process. Right. Because I know that's, would you say would you say that while you're piecing yourself back together, which I kind of wanted to throw in that, there's so many archetypes, right, of that we've been given, stories that we've been given about that process, like Orpheus, coming out from, going into the underworld, coming out and being, torn apart, and the Dionysus, or, or Christ, right, the having to undergo that process of death, and sometimes, dismemberment, being involved. And it's like that is a very, that it's a very real initiation that we're familiar with, but that so few of us are taught the steps, right? Like so few of us get to, sit, at the feet of an elder and learn, what it takes, or, what it looks like, right? Because we're not, I feel like we're not taught, like even those of us who are familiar with those stories, it's like we're not taught how to do it, right? Because do you know what I'm saying?
Right, right. And because part of it is theoretical until you're in it.
Oh yeah.
Part of it is theoretical. They're stories and they're guiding stories. Myths always they point the way, and there's always a truth in them. But on one level, they're theoretical until those gods get a hold of you, reach in and start turning things upside down and inside out and pulling things out. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can talk about it and I can write about it, and it will be helpful to know. It's always helpful. It's why keeping books of writers that I love who've gone through these things help in difficult times. I'll sit in the library and I'll pull, read Robert Bly, or I'll read Stephen's works, or Goethe. To know others have gone this way, they're extremely helpful and very, very important to have those books and have those stories and have these conversations, so we don't feel so bloody alone in it. So we can feel somehow companioned. And that's very, very important as our culture becomes and our society becomes more and more isolated from another. But telling stories and I mean, that's the glue that holds us together, and the riches that we leave, that's part of our inheritance, is to leave these stories for others to find. They're breadcrumbs in the dark forest.
So
All right, we're coming up on time now. Is there anything else that you would like our audience to know about grief and this process, dealing with the god of grief, God that is grief?
Yeah. Trust is a big word that I keep seeing right now in response to that question. Trusting yourself, trusting, this God is ancient. It's been around and it's not going anywhere, and we can't avoid it. We have all kinds of ways to minimize it and to move through quickly, but it's one of the most loving things you can do for yourself and as part of your inheritance and your legacy, is to be a student and trust this process, as excruciating, terrifying, uncomfortable and discomforting as it is. I promise you, on the other side, there's something else, something new, something you couldn't have expected or created without it.
thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
And trust your feelings. Trust your feelings. Your body cannot lie. It is your ally.
So thank you so much, Julie. And just want to let everybody know Julie does have a newsletter and has, I believe, several books in the works coming out, but one that you can order now, which is about the intelligence of the heart. And we'll have links to that there are links to that in the description of this podcast, and letting you know this is part one with Julie. Would love to, if you would like Julie to have you back to talk more maybe about practices for helping people to feel and kind of live from that heart-centered space, which you know about very well, and that I think will assist many people in being able to have that strength and have that capacity to sit with not only grief, but with finding your sacred oak to go sit under, right? Finding your spirits, your ancestors, your guides, who are going to help you move through life with more ease, and honestly with more humanity, right? I don't know if there's a better way you could say that, Julie.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And I'm hoping soon I can make an announcement about pre-orders for the second book, which is The Confluence of Gaia, Plant Medicine, and the Human Soul.
Hmm.
Working on that.
Very, very, very excited.
For sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, Rose. And we'll hopefully have part 2 up and out for you all very soon.
Thank you so much, Crystal and Matthew.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Rose.